A lot to discuss. Let's greet our panel. From Rio de Janeiro, Marcelo Lins is a journalist for GloboNews, the largest 24-hour news channel in Brazil. From Sao Paulo, Gilson Schwartz is a professor of economics at the University of Sao Paulo. Here with us on our set, Paulo Sotero is the director of the Brazil Institute at the Wilson Center for International Scholars, and Thiago de Aragao is the director of strategy at Arko Advice. Welcome to all of you to the show. Thiago, let me start with you. If we look at the situation in Brazil right now, we've got this truck drivers strike, we have oil workers going on strike, there are roadblocks, there are shortages, as we just heard, food, medicine, trying to get through to where they need to. But if we look at oil as a commodity, when there is a shortage of supplies, it has a knock-on effect, doesn't it? It affects prices, supplies, etc. So what is the situation in Brazil right now?
Well, the situation in Brazil is a highly complex one because of the nature of the demands, not only from the truck drivers, but also the expectations of society when they started backing out these strikers. So, for example, when you seek a combination of low taxes, subsidized fuel, plus fiscal austerity that the government has to impose due to the crisis that we had over the past years, this is a math that doesn't close, that doesn't fit. So these expectations, they will always generate an unbalance in one side or another. The problem is not necessarily the demand of oil or the demand of gasoline or diesel, because these are well equipped by the Petrobras. The problem was simply because of our lack of infrastructure, our dependence on highways, and has paid back right now, creating this fantastic ability of the drivers to be able to block the entire country. But it's very important to notice that the price of the fuel, the price of the diesel that's coming out of the refineries isn't within the same level as the world market. So what makes the price in Brazil so abusive is the excessive taxation upon the prices from when it's out of the refinery and it reaches the final consumer.
But Thiago, to a certain extent, Brazil is self-sufficient in oil, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
Wouldn't that affect the price?
No, that doesn't affect the price because it's a very complex environment. We have refineries, but the refineries, they cannot process the entire oil in its entire nature within the refineries as well. There is an optimum amount in which the Brazilian refineries can process oil to transform them into noble fuels. When it goes beyond this optimum amount, it's common not only in Brazil but in any oil-producing country in the world to export this oil and bring it back, because that's a math that you have to use in the equation if you have a company like Petrobras, which is in the stock exchange not only in Brazil but abroad. So this combination is what affects also the final price and does not allow for this government intervention to create a subsidized product if you want to compete as a main producer of oil in the world.
Right, we see the same thing in Iran, actually. It has to export its oil and import refined oil. Paulo, public opinion in Brazil, what is the fault line here? Where does this public fall on this?
Well, the main element of this is that you have a highly unpopular government, you have a highly unpopular political class, and an enormous problem of political legitimacy in government, in the political class. So the explanation that Thiago just gave us, which is a sound one, correct one, it's not something that you can easily sell to Brazilian public opinion now, because you don't have people, leaders with legitimacy capable of articulating that. And this is the center of the issue. What the people are, they are for the strike, and they are obviously against the effects of this strike that the introductory piece explained very well. You have shortages of medicine in supermarkets, of supplies. You have a problem with gasoline. It's not, none of that is lacking in the country. It's the distribution process, directly a result of the strike, which is, by the way, illegal. It was declared illegal. That has a value in Brazil. Brazil, believe it or not, is a country of laws, but is undergoing this enormous crisis of legitimacy. We will have in 4 or 5 months' time an opportunity to try to solve it through new presidential, gubernatorial, general elections. Whether we are going to be able to do it remains to be seen.
Okay, let's bring in Gilson Schwartz. He is in Sao Paulo. Gilson, this is Latin America's biggest economy that we're talking about here, struggling to grow after coming out of a recession about a year ago. How will this strike affect that recovery?
Well, I think we should really settle some facts straight. And these facts go far beyond the present crisis. The main issue is a basic economic policy error, a mistake in the management of the post-2008 crisis in Brazil. That goes back even before the Temer presidency, because we know that Dilma Rousseff, when she came to power for her second term, she opted for a strictly neoliberal receipt, a policy that put all the strength of the measures in a recession. The central bank did really a bad job in terms of managing the interest rate. It contributed to deepening of the recession. So I think that the major macroeconomic issue here is a policy mistake where there were, of course, many issues in economic policy, subsidies, for instance, some incentives that were adopted after the 2008 crisis. But the main issue here is a basic economic policy mistake. That is, trying to adjust problems that are related to prices, to relative prices, by imposing a very, very strong recession on the country. So as you go into recession, consumption goes down, and you had in the previous period a very benevolent policy, a credit policy that led to an expansion in the supply, especially in the supply of credit to truck drivers.
Right.
That was a boom for the auto industry, for the manufacturers of these trucks. So the combination of lower demand and the super expansion of the supply of trucks, that led to an imbalance that is now being treated as a short-term problem. Before we resume economic growth, it's really impossible to solve the price equation in itself.
Marcelo, if we look at what is going on in Brazil right now, there seems to be a bit of an anomaly in the manner in which the Brazilian public is responding to the strike by truck drivers, to these roadblocks, to the strike now by oil workers, because according to a poll done by Datafolha in Brazil, 87% of Brazilians support the strike, with 56% saying it should continue.
Yeah, what we're seeing is some sort of a schizophrenic environment here in Brazil. And people support anything that goes against the government, it looks like, at least by these figures that you've seen from Datafolha poll. But at the same time, people are against having the state paying for any losses that the country had actually in the last in this new chapter of the ongoing economic and political crisis in the country. So people want to protest against the government, but don't want to pay the price if you had to make any deal like the ones that Michel Temer's government just made with the truck drivers on strike. And the interesting thing about this crisis, interesting and maybe problematic as well, is that the Brazilian government conceded to all demands of the strikers even before that the strike was really over, even before that the goods were back flowing to the big cities of these countries, to Sao Paulo, to Rio, to Belo Horizonte. So we had an unfolding crisis, but the demands had already been reached by the government, which had conceded to the truck drivers. So there's not much room for maneuver for this government, which is also, we have to say, highly unpopular, like Mr. Sotero just said. And we are 5 months away from an election, so you see all the political weights being put on the table because people don't want to compromise too much their political careers. Looking at the election that is coming, and at the same time nobody wants to be very close to this very highly unpopular government. So, and apart from that, we have a lack of leadership in the opposition and even in the government side. Right. And the one person who is leading all the polls till now for the election is Mr. Lula, the ex-president, who is in jail in Curitiba. So we have still the corruption scandal of the car wash operation going on. We have the economic crisis in the start of the recovery, very slow, 0.4 in the first quarter of this year. and we don't see what's coming next. We know there's this oil strike right now. We know that the truckers' strike is not over yet, but we don't know what's coming.
Thiago, as we just heard Marcelo tell us, the government has made some concessions. The price of oil has been reduced, an average of 12%. But there's some other factors playing a role here. One is that oil is relatively high now. The international price of oil is relatively high. The Brazilian currency is not doing well against the US dollar as well. So does that narrow the government's options here?
Of course, that narrows the government's options, and the government was aware of that. Whenever you have a movement of a potential strike at this magnitude happening in Brazil, the movement begins a lot long before the strike actually happens. So the government received all the signs that this was about to happen. And there, in my point of view, was not a mistake of Petrobras, was not a mistake in the policy of pricing of Petrobras, because what they're doing is what is the responsible approach to the process. In my view, the mistake came from the lack of narrative developed from the government, first, of anticipating themselves towards the problem, and second, not legitimizing the decision that Petrobras was made. As soon as the decision that Petrobras was made was not legitimized by the government and was not endorsed by the government, it opened a window, a gap, in which the truck drivers' unions perceived that the government was unable to move forward as a bloc. And these showed the flaws on the government's strategy, the government's narrative, amplifying the strike and expanding the list of demands from the truck drivers. So it was a series of mistakes that, in my understanding, was born in the lack of capability of the government foreshadowing what was coming on their way.
Gilson, I know you want to respond to that. Go ahead.
Yeah, please. I want to really take the macroeconomic perspective, actually, because it's really about the economic model. And it's been a choice that the government, the Brazilian government, had to make. We must absolutely make a difference between free prices and managed prices. Oil prices are strategic to a country. Of course, the company, Petrobras as a company, has its targets, its commitments with stockholders. Of course, that's part of the picture. But anyway, for so many decades, oil, energy prices, electric energy prices, these are managed prices by the state. It's a state company. We cannot treat a state company as a private company, and even less treat the market for energy as a free competition market. So I think there is a basic misunderstanding on the nature of public prices. We know that the government has the power to manage prices, incentives. This is clear from the negotiation right now going on. As long as the Petrobras will not take all the losses, someone must pay the bill. So the people, it's a populist standpoint, the people does not want to pay the price. But of course, it's an income distribution issue. You cannot solve it without managing prices. And if the economy does not resume growth, there's absolutely no solution. And it's an illusion to think that free prices floating with international prices will be a solution to a company that is managed by the state. So there are other targets besides the interests of the stockholders. There is a population, the whole economy. The state must manage the prices of a state company.
Okay, Paulo, what is your view on what you've just heard?
Well, there is one thing about Petrobras we have to be clear. Petrobras was assaulted by the government of Brazil in a conspiracy in which participated supposedly popular leftist government with the CEOs and senior executives of some of the most important construction companies in Brazil. We know this because they were sued. Some of them confessed their crimes, served time in jail. There are some people there. And Petrobras has a very small room to maneuver. Pedro Parente, the very able and competent CEO of Petrobras, is doing what he has to do. He is selling assets, reduce the debt, and make Petrobras concentrate on its business. And, well, he has a clear mandate, and knowing Pedro, I know that he's going to fulfill his mandate, or if he is not if the political conditions are no longer there, he will probably find something else to do. He's a very responsible person. I understand what Gilson is saying, but this is a crisis situation with a government that has missed the boat, lacks legitimacy, cannot explain to the people what is going on in a way that the people accept, that the people will understand. The strike is first and foremost against the interest of society, of each individual Brazilian, and let's say, and the chances of resolving this in the election are not very good, because we have how many candidates now? 10, 12, 14. What do they represent ideologically? Don't believe that Mr. Bolsonaro, a very conservative gentleman that is supposedly for the liberal position, don't buy that. He is probably a statist at heart and has already made statements to that regard. So other candidates that are, people are kind of desperate, and politicians are playing to protect their own positions and to save their own skins in this very, very negative and adverse situation.
Marcelo, President Temer appears to be taking a very tough line with the strikers. He's authorized the military to clear roads by force if necessary. Some of these actions have been condemned by human rights groups in Brazil. What is the situation there?
The situation is quite tense, but we haven't seen much violence on the highways specifically. I think that some very important players in this actual crisis have miscalculated what they were doing and the potential consequences of their acts. First of all, Mr. Pedro Parente, which I also think is a very responsible CEO for Petrobras, and he took this company to try to clean it after this whole scandal of corruption that Mr. Sotero was talking about. But at the same time, I don't know if he had his numbers right when he decided that the best option was not to use Petrobras anymore to try and control inflation and the prices of oil in the internal market, and to float the prices as free prices with the international market, because this was done with no transition rule, and some of the effects of the actual crisis come from this option that maybe if he had been a bit more careful, he would have a better result as well. And as long as Mr. Temer is concerned, he mobilized, he called upon the military to intervene and to make the truckers go out of the road, to let the flow of goods pass and everything. But at the same time, he didn't convene with the governors, the state governors, which are directly implicated in this crisis, because most of the taxes that go into the final gas and oil prices on the streets here in Brazil, they come from state taxes. And also, when you need to have a police solution for some problem, you call the states, and then afterwards you would call the federal law enforcement agencies, being the federal police or the army. So I think that there's lots of miscalculation in this crisis that got us to this point where we are right now.
Thiago, what kind of political impact will this have in Brazil? You know, as Paulo said a moment ago, are we in some kind of holding pattern right now until the election? I mean, is President Temer effectively a lame duck president right now?
Well, Brazil is not a country that a president is fully a lame duck because of the ability and the power that the president still has of the pen. Just in comparison mode, in the US, a president can appoint 3,000 positions in government, while in Brazil, he can appoint 25,000 positions. Of course, there is not much more time for him to produce anything new, but he still holds a very powerful seat in South America. However, this crisis really weakened a lot the administration, and not because of the timing towards the end, but because of this lack of coordination that Marcelo explained also very well right now. So what I see is that this crisis will definitely impact the election, because it's another topic that you're putting on the table. And even if it's not a topic about Petrobras, it will be a topic about taxes, because taxes as security are the two topics that are the most democratic problems in Brazil today, because everyone experiences in a way or another a problem with these two areas. So taxes and security will definitely play a major role in the elections, and naturally the way that certain candidates portray themselves now during this strike will have an impact on how they will behave during the electoral month.
Go ahead, Paulo.
One thing that I find extraordinary in all of this, and to be a little bit on the hopeful side, is that I believe in other countries, in other latitudes, this amount of pressure, this amount of adversity would already have produced significant explosions of violence. And in Brazil, I think Brazilian society has a collective wisdom of staying calm. People fully recognize the nature of the problem, but I think people in Brazil accept this is a mess that was made by ourselves. We cannot blame others this time. Right. And to wait, the polls, don't believe in them right now because only 40% of Brazilians are apparently sharing their opinion with posters. So we don't know what happens, and we still have the World Cup, so that could also maybe lighten the mood a little bit.
Gilson, if we look at the conduct of this election, and something that it has in common with that the strike, something that it has in common with the strike that took place in 2013 as well, is that there seems to be a lack of a unified leadership at the top of the strikers, at the top of the unions. It seems to be more of workers actually communicating with each other. Does it make it more difficult then to negotiate with the workers?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, we are living in Brazil in a sense, one of the most transparent societies in the world. We have approved the law of fiscal responsibility. After all, that was used against President Dilma because she was supposedly mismanaging taxes and revenues. So there is a high degree of transparency in Brazil. I think that the strike brings about even more transparency. I think that political candidates, presidential candidates, must address these issues. But no doubt, I think there's lots of lessons to be learned here. And one of them is that unions, workers' unions as we knew it in the 19th and especially in the 20th century, are over. If you look at the present situation, the labor reform that was implemented, the trends are towards a more atomistic and fragmented labor market in Brazil.
Right.
So what comes let's say, in substitution for the traditional unions is new networks, new communication schemes. The instantaneous communication makes up for leadership. There are local leaders all over the country. There are different groups, different associations. So there is, at the forefront of this process, a new communication pattern that leads into activists going to the streets. So you mentioned very, very well remembered what happened in 2013. It's a bottom-up movement, and it's really very much leveraged by new communication technologies.
Right. Marcelo, there were fears that the trucker strike could lead to a military coup. In fact, President Temer intervened in that. He said there's no chance that that could happen. But what are your thoughts on that? Could there be military intervention?
I don't think so. I bet that Brazilian society as a whole wouldn't support this sort of way out of this crisis, a military coup. But unfortunately, it's a bit worrying that we've seen signs, even among some of the strikers, some of the truck drivers on strike, asking for a military intervention in the country, as if in the military rule, the country was more organized than it is today. The thing, as some of my previous colleagues said just there, is that we have a very transparent society nowadays. It's very difficult to hide corruption. I think that we're in the process of trying to find out all that was built on corruption in this country, and it's much, because it's the whole big building companies in these countries, some of the biggest enterprises that had lots of corruption scandals among them, and they have to deal with this right now. I think that the only way out of this crisis will be democratically. And yes, I agree that we are seeing also the effects of what happened in 2013, is that people on the streets saying that they are against everything that is out there, which is the our democratic system, our government, the unions, but also the traditional political parties. And also in the brighter side of all this discussion here, I think that we can see that some new leaderships will appear, and hopefully for this next election or in the next cycle at least.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CGTN America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.